Hello, and welcome to Forward Fest. We are so glad you are here engaging in the bold ideas, creative approaches, and, yes, you guessed it, forward thinking that make Princeton the special place that it is. We want to hear from you throughout a year of forward thinking, and particularly during Forward Fest. Be sure to tag any of your forward thinking posts on social media with hashtag Princeton Forward. That includes any questions or comments you want to share with the Princetonians who will be broadcast today. It is my pleasure to introduce you to the moderator of our Thinking Forward to Election 2020 session, Melanie Lawson of the great class of 1976. Melanie is an award-winning journalist and a current member of the Princeton University Board of Trustees. She will be leading a thoughtful discussion with our four forward thinkers today. Melanie, great to see you, and over to you.
Welcome to Princeton University's Forward Fest and today's session, Thinking Forward to Election 2020. My name is Melanie Lawson and I'm a proud member of the great Princeton class of 1976, and I am delighted to be with you today. I'm looking forward to a riveting discussion on how we as both individuals and as society are approaching election 2020 here in the U.S. This is certainly the most significant election in recent history against the backdrop of the worst pandemic in more than a century. So you could call this the perfect storm in so many ways. I'm thrilled to be joined by four of Princeton's forward thinkers in this area. And if you will forgive me my glasses. With us today, Andrew Appel, who is the Eugene Higgins Professor of Computer Science and a member of Princeton's class of 1981. Also, Heather Howard, Director of the State Health and Value Strategies Program, the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, and lecturer in the School of Public and International Affairs. Kevin Cruz, who is a professor of history at Princeton, and Jacob Shapiro, who is a professor of politics and international affairs. So we want to begin with Professor Shapiro. And I believe the biggest thing on everyone's mind right now is whether or not we can actually trust the results of this election, which is a frightening thing to say. And one of the first things anyone brings up in this topic is election tampering. If you would you defend this for us, define it, if you will, and talk about the work that you and your students and your colleagues have been doing looking into election tampering?
So, hey, Melanie, it's great to speak with you. And the thing that my group has been working on is the tampering in the information ecosystem around the election. So the efforts of foreign countries and different actors within our country to push misinformation and incorrect information into that ecosystem, that set of information that people are relying on to figure out what they should do in the election. And it's coming from a lot of different places. It's coming from foreign countries, it's coming from domestic political groups, and it's coming from some people who've just figured out how to make a buck on misinformation. And so they're pumping out whatever they think is going to drive the most ad revenue.
I got you. Well, your groundbreaking study last year found that Russia is by far the most active perpetrator of voting interference, but China, Saudi Arabia, and now we've learned Iran are recently joining the fray. As you look into this, how are you able to determine where the interference is coming from?
So I want to be really careful about this. There's not actually evidence that any of those countries have interfered directly in voting.
Okay.
What we've seen those countries doing in a number of places, 30 countries around the world since 2013, is reaching out into the social media ecosystem, and through a combination of fake social media and propaganda on outlets like RT and Sputnik and China Today, trying to shape the political discussion in ways that are advantageous to their foreign policy interests. So, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Go on. No, you go on.
Well, so we saw this in the United States in 2016. In 2017, Russia attempted it in France. In 2019, in the UK. There have been dozens of elections around the world where different countries have tried this. Fortunately, it is still the vast majority of it is still coming from Russia. Other countries haven't gotten into it. But the thing that worries me a lot about this is there are 16 countries, other than the four that you mentioned, which have reached out and used this toolkit on their own population. So the skills to do this are pretty widespread in the world. It's just so far only a few states have tried to use it on other countries.
We'll talk about the social media aspect of it, because we're learning a lot about the fact that certainly in 2016, they were able to reach into certain Facebook groups and to different organizations. And what is the role, would you say, of certainly these large social media companies in terms of controlling some of that misinformation?
So the companies have all, to different levels and in different ways, been trying to wrap their hands around a bunch of different kinds of information they don't want on the platforms. So there's political misinformation. There's also content that they don't want, child pornography, things about drugs, terrorism, and whatnot. And so they've built a lot of capacity to say, look, that thing, that type of content, we don't want that, and to sweep it out. So the ability to do that's great. The question is, what are the policies they're setting around this? And have they figured out how to discern what should come down and what should stay up? You know, when we think about like how we finance elections, it's okay for you or me to invest in a campaign, but it's not okay for, you know, a French citizen or a British citizen, right? We've set that law. With online information, that becomes a very hard line for the companies to draw, because it's often very difficult to figure out, is this account being run by an American who has a First Amendment right to say this kind of thing about this election? Or is this being run by someone else who doesn't have those rights and in other areas of our law doesn't have the ability to participate in the discussion around elections? And this is a very hard challenge for them.
And that's what I don't quite understand. It seems as though in some ways they were kind of behind the eight ball when it came to really identifying some of the misinformation that was out there, some of the false stories. Why do you think it took so long for them to figure it out? Or was it simply reluctance on their part?
So I think part of it comes down to the self-identity of the people who led the companies in 2016, right? Up to that point, their like vision of themselves was as these people who were bringing this tool to the world that was going to enhance society through conversation. And in 2016, they were smacked in the side of the head with the fact that the tools and the systems they created and the public sphere that they were enabling could also have those bad influences. Now, there had been evidence of that here and there before, but in 2016, it really came home to roost for companies, the majority of whose staff are Americans, live in America, and are based here. And so I think at that point, you saw a lot of effort start to go into trying to do this. Now, what we haven't seen, unfortunately, is a very clear bipartisan consensus in our country that says, no, this is not okay. Foreign countries should not be able to reach into our political discussions and shape them. And so we're going to work together as Americans to sweep that out. What happened is it became a partisan political issue. And that then put the companies in a terrible position, because their customers are Democrats and Republicans and independents and socialists and libertarians, like all types. And if once this became a partisan issue, it immediately became really challenging for them to enact policies that would keep all their customers happy. And like, look, at the end of the day, yeah, they're running a public sphere, but they're for-profit companies. They have to keep the customers happy. And so it's just like a very hard thing for them as organizations to manage.
Yeah, I guess so, trying to discern which one. Now, one of your most recent projects has involved tracking misinformation relating to the coronavirus. And I can't think of anything scarier. In what way is this connected to sort of amplifying the division in our society right now? And certainly the fact that even the coronavirus has become very partisan.
For sure. So you saw two things, I think, happening with the coronavirus that worsened some of those divisions. One was in the US and look, in lots of other countries around the world too, people started to leverage corona and questions about the response for political purposes, for whatever their like fights that they were in of that day were. And so it became very partisan, not because of anything inherent in corona, but everyone was talking about this one thing. And it was a conversation where you could always say the other side was screwing up because we didn't know what right was. We didn't know how good we could do. And so it's like this wonderful issue for political fights. And you saw this in lots of countries. The other thing that started to happen is a lot of misinformation actors realized that they could make money by promoting false cures, false hope, giving people content about corona that made them feel good, like things are going in the right direction. They would then go to that site, and that would generate revenue for the people who own the site. So you had the for-profit people coming in, and then you had people taking this new issue and figuring out how to politicize it. And together, I think those created a lot of misinformation.
You know, and that's interesting when you talk about the for-profit aspects of all of this, because as I understand it, there are actors in other countries who do this for-profit. Is that correct? And you've been able to kind of track some of that down?
Well, so I wouldn't say we've been able to track it down. We've been able to pull the information together on it. What what happens in a number of countries is people have realized there are lots of ways to make money off any kind of content that grabs attention. And the social media companies have set up massive ecosystems, and there are dozens of other business-to-business companies that make it possible to make money anytime you can draw people to content. And so there are people who specialize in sports, and there are people who specialize in entertainment and news about celebrities, and there are people who specialize in grabbing eyeballs with misinformation. And some of those are not even based in the U.S. So there's like this cluster in Kosovo, and another one in Albania, and a third in Macedonia, where the hacker kids in a couple of towns have figured out that they can make money by putting up political misinformation in the US. And it kind of gets passed down how to do that. And so we have people setting up Facebook pages and trying to draw people in, not because they care 2 cents about how US politics goes, because they're making a buck off it. And that then contributes possibly to the polarization, because now there's all this salacious kind of high emotional content out there.
This may be a naive question on my part, so I apologize in advance, but is there a way we can determine as we peruse our Instagram account or our Facebook page or something, can we figure out when there are bad actors there or misinformation?
So I think figuring out the bad actors, Melanie, I think is very hard. And all the evidence is that a tiny portion of people actually interact with them directly. And there are already people who are really highly polarized. But what people can do pretty easily is figure it out. Is this fact which someone shared with me, is it true? There are great sources for that. At the level of, can I trust this platform? There's a company called NewsGuard that does a great job rating different news platforms, and they've rated about 5,000 of them now. You can go to their website and see. And then there's the AP, PolitiFact, Snopes, all these companies out there that let you search on particular stories or information to see, has someone independently looked at this and seen if it's true? So what we can do as consumers is when a family member or friend sends us something that gets us like really riled up and makes us, hate President Trump or hate Vice President Biden or whatever, we can pause for a minute, hit one of these sites, say, hey, is that true or not? And then pass it on only if we've done that like little 30 seconds of research. And that would, shut a lot of this down.
All right. I've got just one quick question for you
Sure.
before we go. And I'm just fascinated by the process that you and your team have been able to sort of scour the misinformation you're finding on the internet. How do you do it?
So we actually rely on the efforts of others. One of the amazing things we learned in doing the work on COVID is all around the world, there are networks of grassroots fact-checking organizations that have sprung up to police this stuff and identify misinformation and call it out. Now, what hasn't happened as well as it could yet is the platforms haven't figured out how can we take all this work that thousands of people are doing around the world and wrap that together so that the average consumer can benefit from it instead of having to go out and like search it out. But what gives me a lot of hope in this is you've got literally tens of thousands of people around the world spending their free time trying to find the BS and call it out. And like, that's got to give you some hope.
Yeah, it absolutely does. One of the things I want to do before I let you go, Jake, you were recently interviewed for Beyond the Ballot, which is a new podcast at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. So we just want to listen to that clip. And thank you again.
You're welcome.
I suspect we will see isolated incidents of interference and malfeasance and people's votes going awry and vote counts being unrealistic and intrusion against election systems and people screwing with voter registration databases. But I don't think it is feasible for any country to pull off a coordinated attack to try and get a particular outcome or create a level of uncertainty that would make it impossible to know who's won within a few days of the election without leaving completely obvious fingerprints all over the place. The kind of risks to doing that seem so massive and unpredictable that I can't imagine a country trying to do it.
And we want to thank Jake so much. But now we also want to talk again with Professor Andrew Appel, who is an expert in computer security and election technology. The perfect person, I think, to continue this conversation about the perceptions and realities of security when we vote. And unfortunately, I think you have experience with this because while we may know more about it this time around, this is certainly not the first time that an election has been, how shall I put it, the way we vote has been up in terms of questioned, up for discussion.
Indeed. In the 20th century, not a lot of people studied the technology of how we vote. I didn't study it. And then in November of the year 2000, all of a sudden, the technology of how we vote became very important. And we learned from that punch card ballots are just a terrible technology. The hanging chads, the butterfly ballots, they just didn't accurately record the votes. And then a lot of states switched in 2002, 2003 to touchscreen computerized voting machines. And as a computer scientist, many computer scientists realized right away that this is an even worse technology in some sense, because the touchscreen voting machines were completely hackable. Any election thief that could manage to install fraudulent software in there that miscounts the votes in favor of one candidate could steal votes at a massive scale. So the computer scientists got organized to explain these issues to the policymakers in states and counties in the federal government. And, between 2003 and maybe 2015, many states moved away from that paperless touchscreen voting system and adopted a more reliable technology, which is hand-marked optical scan paper ballots. You fill in the bubble and you run it through the optical scan voting machine, either right there in the precinct, or you send it in and they put it in the ballot box or mail it in and they count it centrally. Now, those optical scan voting machines are also computers and they're also hackable. Mm-hmm. But you have that pile of paper ballots that the voters actually marked, and in a recount, you can see for yourself. The recounters, the teams, bipartisan teams of recounters with witnesses can see what's on those paper ballots. And so what's happened in the last few years is that almost all the states now has shifted to this more reliable technology, the paper ballots. And then now in the year of the COVID, even those states that were sort of backward and still having touchscreen machines, like New Jersey, for example, are voting almost entirely or in large part by paper ballots. That is, the mail-in ballots that we get at home and fill out with the pen. Those are the paper ballots where there really is a paper trail that goes from the voter to the possible recount team or audit team. And so in that way, the technology of how we vote in this election may be more reliable in the US on the average than any election in the last 20 years.
Well, that is certainly consoling, especially since you're using both. I'm going to ask you to sort of step back for a moment. It's been 20 years since that incredible election in 2000, and the fact that it took us, close to a month to know who actually won that election, such as it is. Describe a little bit about what happened in 2000, because I'm sure there's some folks who are listening to this who may not realize all the ins and outs.
Right. Well, the election of the year 2000 was very close in the Electoral College, and it all came down to the state of Florida. And the election in the state of Florida was very close. And so it got a lot of attention. And as people started looking at the actual ballots and voting machines, they found that the punch card ballots that were used in some counties in Florida, the voter would use a kind of stylus to punch a certain hole, that would supposed to punch out a little rectangular chad, it's called, in the punch card. And immediately on sort of looking at the ballots after the election, at least two important problems were found. First is that the little holder for the stylus didn't work in a lot of cases. It got stuffed up with old chads, and so a voter would punch through and the chad wouldn't punch out. It would just get a little bit of dimpled. And the second problem is that the way the holder was laid out, that had the candidates' names, on the holder and a little hole to punch out, the holes didn't line up very well with where the punches went. And so voters who thought they were voting for Al Gore, for example, would actually be punching the hole for Pat Buchanan. Those were not the only technological issues in the state of Florida that led to an unreliable vote count, but the examination of all those punch card ballots one at a time, in some cases with magnifying glasses, to figure out, what the technology was telling you about what the voter's intent was, that recount took a month.
Yeah, it was crazy. And the first time most of us even knew there was a chat outside of the country in Africa, Well, voting in the U.S. is fairly decentralized, and I think most of us recognize that, with decisions about voting methods and apparatuses often being controlled at the state and even the local level. What are kind of the upsides and downsides of this from the standpoint of security when it comes to voting?
Well, there's some problems. There really are 9,000 different jurisdictions, counties, states, cities, that choose their own voting equipment and run their own elections. And now every one of those counties and so on has to somehow defend themselves against Russian hackers. And it's hard enough for a major corporation with a big security staff to defend themselves against, hackers from all around the world. It's even more difficult for these counties. So the election management computers, there's ordinary PCs that run election management software that aggregate the vote totals together from the different precincts. The counties have had to figure out as best they can how to protect themselves. Some of the methods are don't connect that stuff to the internet as much as possible. Some of the methods are avail themselves of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security's sort of teams of security advisors, sort of consultants available for the counties and states to make use of, to learn how to protect themselves. But the hackability of all the computers in these election systems make it even more important that we have a way to vote. There's a paper trail that goes from the ballot that the voter marks to that very same ballot that can be recounted in a recount if there's any question about whether the computers may have been hacked.
Is there a resistance to the idea of a uniform or unified system, presumably at the federal level, that would apply to virtually every county, every city in the country?
Well, the Constitution gives the Congress the power to prescribe the time, place, and manner of elections. And so one example of prescribing the manner of elections is that after Florida in the year 2000, the Congress banned punch card voting systems. And so no state was allowed to use punch card voting systems anymore. And the states did not complain about that because everybody could see that it was a terrible technology. I think it would be a good idea to have more baselines. If the states and counties are still going to run their elections, there should be a requirement to have end-to-end audits of the paper trail of the ballots, right? We don't have to have a full recount of the paper ballots every time, but we can have a random audit using modern statistical methods that spot checks that the ballots are saying, when we look at them with our own eyes, the ballots say what the computer said. The computers are not lying about what's on the ballots, that the computers have not been hacked this time. And we need to make that kind of audit happen after every election as part of the election process.
With only a couple of seconds left, do you see the possibility of a uniform system anytime soon?
I think the Congress will pass laws that make things better, but I still think the Congress will largely leave to the states and the counties the ability to run elections.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Professor Appel. We really appreciate it. And of course, you'll be back in just a few moments with the rest of the group, and we'll talk about more issues like this. But in the meantime, we're going to take a quick 15-second break. We'll be right back. And we are back again, this time with Professor of History, Kevin Cruz, to get a historical look at how we as a voting population have felt about the legitimacy of our election process over the years, which is a sad statement to even have to make, Professor Cruz, the fact that we have to question the legitimacy. But we have so much to learn from history in terms of how people generally feel about the climate out there in politics and the power and the weight of their voices. And one topic that has had an effect on both is that of voting rights and voter suppression. And that has been a major topic this time around, which seems to have happened in waves over the years. Where are we now in terms of the sequence of waves? Is there a stronger sense by the public, perhaps, the recognition of issues like voter suppression?
Yes, there is, and this is something that you're right. This has come and gone in waves. You know, when we think about the 1960s and the not just the Voting Rights Act, but the reapportionment cases before the Supreme Court, there was a move in the late 60s to even do away with the Electoral College that almost happened. So there's a real surge there in both protecting and expanding the right to vote, defending the franchise, but also democratizing our institutions. And those changes were welcomed at the time by both parties. We used to see Congress routinely renew the Voting Rights Act by overwhelming margins. Republican presidents and Democratic presidents alike would sign these renewals. But then we had the case of Shelby County versus Holder in 2013, which basically eviscerated the Voting Rights Act. And has opened up the door to a new wave of voter suppression campaigns, some bordering on voter intimidation. And what we've seen over the past 7 years is an incredible new wave of these laws at the state levels, not just in the South, but across the country. And so we have seen really remarkable levels of voter suppression, both in terms of restrictions on when and where and how people can vote, on new hurdles they have to jump through in order to register, or to they have to have documentation like voter ID. I think most perniciously, we've seen the massive closing of polling places all across the country. And so we're already seeing even early voting, people waiting in lines of 6, 8, 10 hours just to cast their vote. So all of those changes have really swept up, and we're living in an election in which voter suppression is a really pronounced issue. But to your point about do voters notice this? Yes, they do. Not just when they're in line. It's become a real topic of conversation in the national media and in communities. And we're starting to actually see evidence. I think I've seen reports of this. We don't have the data or even the anecdotes really to back this up, but it seems like, given what we're seeing with this surge in turnout, that some of these voter suppression campaigns are actually backfiring. If you go so far to make it harder for people to vote, some people take that as a challenge and step up and respond by with a new determination to vote.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right. Anecdotally, as a news reporter, we hear that a lot. People saying, I'm going to stand in line as long as it takes to be able to vote. I do want to ask, though, about the case back in 2013 and the decision that the Supreme Court made. Did it basically take away federal oversight, especially in those areas that were historically more discriminatory?
Yeah. So what was in place? The key part of the decision is that the major innovation of the Voting Rights Act was that it used history to show that there were certain states across the South that had engaged in systematic efforts to disfranchise or discriminate against African American voters. Mm-hmm. And what the VRA did was basically set up a mechanism that required pre-clearance for any of these states on the Department of Justice's list. If they wanted to change their voting laws in any way, they had to clear them first with the Department of Justice. And the Department of Justice would say, yes, you can do this. No, you can do this. The VRA, the Shelby County decision basically gutted that. And we don't have that pre-clearance anymore, which means that southern states and states all across the country can engage in a variety of discriminatory measures to suppress the vote. And then only after the fact can the courts or the DOJ come in to judge them. So it used to be that we would head off problems before they happen. And now the attitude that the court has promulgated is that we'll let these problems happen and then we'll try to fix them after the fact, which is a much harder thing to do.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you about that. I'm from Texas, and in particular Harris County, and right now we are dealing with a governor who wanted to reduce the number of ballot boxes per county. In some counties that are only this big, it's fine, but Harris County is the largest in the state of Texas, and it means 1,700 square miles of a county, and you've got to drive to one location.
4.7 million people, right?
Right, exactly. Is that one of the newer methods of trying to suppress voting?
Yeah, and there are countless new methods. What's really amazing is that the innovations to which people will go to try to deny the franchise, and that's certainly one of them. And we've seen in court cases, there was a case out of North Carolina, for instance, where a federal judge said that the restrictions that they'd done in North Carolina were done to target the black vote with, quote, almost surgical precision. And there's no doubt about what the intent is here, both in terms of who is being targeted for these changes and who believes it'll benefit them politically.
And we're seeing, you know, I'm glad you brought up the issue of race, because that traditionally has been the target, I would imagine, black voters, to some extent brown voters. But now, are we not seeing voter suppression on a much wider scale? And in this case, to sort of determine where perhaps one party might have stronger ties than the other?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And honestly, and again, to go back to the point about this backfiring, I think that's actually what's going to happen. I think it was easy for say a typical middle-class white person to ignore voter suppression when it was only targeting African Americans in the South, and to think that wasn't an issue, to universalize their own experience of the polls. Well, I had no trouble voting. I had no trouble getting a voter ID. It must not be a problem for anybody. But as these campaigns get wider and broader, what's happening is more and more people are finding themselves personally affected. Those long lines, it's not just African Americans stuck in those long lines. It's voters of every race, class, background, whatever. And so they're experiencing this themselves. And I think it's creating a sense of solidarity among voters in terms of who are feeling these restrictions imposed upon them.
Mm-hmm. Now, when people do get a chance to vote, it sometimes feels like that vote doesn't really count. And in particular, the last time around, we saw the Electoral College determine who won as opposed to the popular vote. So is it time now to really consider reforming the Electoral College and that process of voting? There's certainly been a lot of talk about that.
Yeah, there absolutely is. I mean, and it's, the Electoral College has never really, we have to remember the Electoral College wasn't part of the greatest hits of the Founding Fathers. It was a system they came up with when they were basically deadlocked at the end of a long session, and they agreed to this as a compromise nobody really liked. It was, and it wasn't that they feared the popular vote, as many people mistakenly assume and argue today. The alternative was that Congress itself would pick the president. They decided that was a little too much of a conflict of interest. They would create this thing off to the side, this once every 4 years effective knockoff of Congress, the Electoral College. They would meet and they would step in and cast the votes based on what people in the states had done. So from the start, it was never really popular or loved or enshrined as something noble. There are people today who defend it as if it was the greatest thing the founders came up with. The founders strongly disagreed with that. And in fact, the founders didn't fear majority will. We've seen efforts over the years to tinker with this. After the 1968 election, a campaign that had been building over the 60s to do away with the Electoral College nearly came to pass. There was a constitutional amendment passed the House, but not the Senate. It didn't pass the Senate because segregationist Southern Democrats basically blocked it and didn't want it to happen. But there have been efforts to get around the Electoral College beyond a constitutional amendment. We've seen this with some states. So Maine and Nebraska have what they call a district system, where they can actually slice and dice their Electoral College votes by district, which make their states much more competitive. You'll see Joe Biden is campaigning for that Nebraska 2 district. Trump will push for one of the main ones, right? And so both parties are competing in these states we otherwise might ride out. There's an even better way around this, which is something Colorado tried in 2004, which is to pass what they called a proportional system, where they would basically divide their electoral votes by the proportion that the two candidates got, roughly, got in the state election, and send them out that way. That failed in the 2004 election, but it can certainly be revisited. So the states can get around this. But I think we are at a point where the Electoral College, as hard as it is to change, as difficult as it is to uproot, we are reaching a crisis point where it's going to happen. We'd had elections in the past where a president lost the popular vote but won office thanks to the Electoral College. But the current president and the Republican president before him both got into office by losing the popular vote and winning the Electoral College. In 2000 this happened, and in 2016 it happened. Should it happen again, I think we'll really be at a crisis point, because it'll really suggest to most Americans that the democratic process is fundamentally flawed and even illegitimate. And as these things get worse, like in 2000, Al Gore won the popular vote by about 500,000 votes and lost the Electoral College narrowly. In 2016, Donald Trump lost the national popular vote by almost 3 million votes and won the Electoral College by an even larger margin than Bush had. We're going to have a possible situation in the coming years, I don't think this year, but it could plausibly happen, where somebody wins the popular vote by 7, 8 million votes and is denied the presidency to the Electoral College. And if that happens, if it's that big of a disjoint between the popular vote and the Electoral College, I do think you'll see a real movement to get it changed if it hasn't already.
All right. Well, Professor Cruz, you've left us at a perfect point. We want to talk about that a little bit later on in our conversation. But first, after taking a quick short break, we're going to talk more about the pandemic and how that affects our voting and affects the election in just a moment. Thank you so much, Professor.
Thank you.
We're joined, first of all, welcome back, everybody. But I'm being joined by Heather Howard, who is an expert in U.S. healthcare policy, particularly as it is handled at the state level. And I am so appreciative of you being here, Professor Howard. We appreciate it. The outbreak of the coronavirus and the massive crisis, economic crisis that it really triggered, is another reason why 2020 is being called an emergency election in some ways. We're looking at a vast gulf between the candidates, for instance. You are a lecturer at the Princeton School of International and Public Affairs, but you're also director of the Robert Wood Johnson funded State Health and Value Strategies program. Tell us a little bit about what you and your colleagues are working on, and especially in the shadow of this huge election.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's really fun to be here. And as the previous speakers mentioned, so much of this election is, so much of the excitement is happening at the state level, right? States are administering the election. States are, quite frankly, also filling the void where, in an absence of strong federal leadership in responding to the coronavirus, states are responding, right? So to people researching state health policy, it's an amazing opportunity to see state variation. And of course, that's colliding with the election. As you noted, the coronavirus has upended completely the landscape of voting. And you've got states scrambling to recruit poll workers, because poll workers tend to be the elderly and people who are at higher risk for coronavirus. So the pool from which they normally recruit is not there. You've got voters clearly signaling, I want more options for voting because I want to vote safely. So what's been interesting to watch is that more than 30 states have responded by loosening voting rules to make it easier for people to vote early or by mail, so that it can be done more safely. And so that's been really interesting to see. So some examples of that, some states have eliminated the requirement that you have to have a justification to vote by mail. It used to be that you had to have, you had to say, for example, I'm going to be traveling, I can't vote on that day, right? They've eliminated that requirement, so it's much easier. States have made it. New Jersey is a great example, actually. New Jersey this year, without application, just mailed mail ballots to every registered voter in the state, and even it has a return address is paid. So they're making it really easy for people to vote. So over 30 states have made it easier to vote. And I think what you're seeing is, as a result, is that we have record-breaking early voting because people have more options to vote. Now, that said, when you leave things up to state variation, as you were just exploring with Kevin, you have some bright spots and some less bright spots, right? And, so I'll give you an example. One thing we study is what's happening to vulnerable populations. And one state, for example, I'll give you, Alabama has made it easier to vote by mail. They eliminated that requirement that you had to have a reason for voting by mail, but they still require you to either have your ballot notarized or have 2 witnesses. Mm-hmm. Now, if you're, if you're trying to self-isolate, if you're vulnerable, if you have health comorbidities, if you're elderly, to have to go out and find a notary or to get 2 adults come over to your house to witness your ballot, that may be putting you at risk. So there's actually been litigation by organizations that represent people with disabilities saying this is not fair. You're putting people with disabilities at greater risk. Though that litigation has failed. So
they are in effect kind of canceling out or negating the ability to have more options.
Exactly. So I think, the good news story was that most states were moving to make it easier. But then actually, as you often find when you look at state variation, you need to scratch the surface and see what's really happening in practice. And so, you mentioned yourself what's happening in Harris County, right? So that when you have only one drop-off box, and then then that means that really limits options for people. In this example, so several states still require witnessing, and that means people have to subject themselves maybe to somebody outside their family to witness, and that may put them at risk. So I think overall a good story, but long lines, as you and Kevin were just discussing too. That could put people at risk if in their community people are not observing the practices that the CDC recommends, if people aren't wearing masks and they aren't social distancing, asking people to wait for hours and hours, if they're not, taking care, is also putting them at risk.
Now, we've seen some instances of, for instance, mailboxes that are spirited away and the like. Have you, in your studies, seen a lot of instances, other than that you've already mentioned, where there are attempts either by the local government or even all the way up to the federal government to negate the ability to be able to vote using your health as an issue?
Yes. I mean, it's, in Mississippi, for example, actually, there was a big debate about whether you could just claim, I'm worried about COVID, or do you have to have a specific comorbidity, right? Do you have to have a specific disease that makes you susceptible? And we were talking earlier about vulnerable populations. We know that COVID is having a disproportionate impact on communities of color and older people, right? And so if you're going to require people to have specific reasons, you may be excluding people who are vulnerable, but not for specific reasons, but maybe because of the impact of systemic racism, right? So I think it's this example, what you mentioned too, you might have, in some states, you have a tension between a county and a state. Sometimes you have tensions between a state and the federal government. Sometimes you have tensions within a state where you might have, like you've seen in Texas, Harris County is in conflict with the state. So it's testing it's testing these principles of federalism and who gets to decide.
If voters don't necessarily agree with how their state is handling COVID, and we've certainly seen that kind of clash in a number of cases, are they less trusting of the decisions around how voting is happening? Do they tend to be very skeptical about that as well?
Well, I do think, it's a good question. There is research that shows that voting in and of itself is associated with good health outcomes, right? That civic engagement may be associated with being healthier, and that communities that have higher rates of voting tend to be healthier. So people who work in health policy actually work on increasing voter turnout, and you may not, that may not be intuitive to people, but there is that link. The more people are invested in their communities, the better, the more there may be broader engagement in creating healthy options for people. So I do worry that that some of these efforts to suppress the vote may lead to people losing faith in their institutions, and we could see the downstream impact of that in poorer health.
Well, of course, on top of everything else, the coronavirus and the national election, the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, is about to look at the potential of striking down the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. Does the voting public kind of understand that as well, that how their votes are intertwined with issues like this on the wider scale, way beyond the election?
I think they do. I mean, I think because certainly some politicians have tried to help make that case. If you look at the confirmation hearing for Amy Coney Barrett, that was a constant topic of the Democratic members of the Senate committee asking about the Affordable Care Act, because the hearing, as you just mentioned, the hearing on whether the Affordable Care Act is constitutional is 1 week to the day after the election. And it looks like Amy Coney Barrett, she's going to be seated, she's going to be hearing it. So Democrats on the committee use that as an opportunity to bring that home. But of course, it is hard for people to associate the sort of a theoretical Supreme Court case that's being heard after the election. But certainly you've seen Democrats trying to remind people of what's at stake.
So you haven't seen, for instance, a whole lot of reaction to that by individual voters. It's more of a big picture item for Democrats.
Well, I think, historically, like in 2018, healthcare policy was always one of the top concerns of voters. And I think this year that's morphed into more COVID, obviously, people's concern for their own health. But health is always a top concern and has been over the last several elections.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Howard. What we're going to do now is take just a short break, and we've got a message from some students who are trying to get out the vote in a big way at Princeton. And then all four of us, really all five, including me, will be back in just a moment to have a larger conversation. But thank you so much, Professor. Well, we are all back right now, and we want to really get into a larger conversation, I think, looking at all of these incredible experts in their own areas, but really talking about the larger issue of this election as it comes up. And I want to begin by going back to the issue of voter suppression and voter concerns, only because I think that for a lot of people, as you said, Professor Cruz, for the first time, many of us are realizing, wait a minute, voter suppression may mean me too. And it's sort of a realization that we haven't had up until now. So if you would help us understand a little bit more about what can be done by the electorate and not just by the officials.
Well, what the electorate can do is first of all, not be deterred from voting. That's the most important thing you can do. Vote yourself and make a plan now to vote if you have not already. I can't stress that enough. That's one of the biggest things that we found deters people. They simply think, oh, that's election day, I'll get to it. And then they get busy with other stuff and they realize they can't wait in line. Really make a plan for that and know that it might be the whole day. Talk to your friends and family about getting out to vote. Really wear out your contact list on your phone and really talk to people about this. And most important, I think, is to, when you get into the ballot box or you send your ballot in by mail, however you do it, really think about the votes you're casting and not just the ones at the top of the ticket, not just the ones for president or your congressperson or senator if you've got that. Really think in terms of locally. A lot of the acts of voter suppression and the obstacles to, I think, a more clear voting process happen at the state level, because that's how our elections work. They're, as we noted earlier, they're supervised locally. So make it clear to your state legislators, to your governor, to any official you can vote for, what you're voting for and why you voted, and really take a look at who is suppressing the vote and who is encouraging a more open voting, and reward that behavior. The reason voting suppression happens is because the people pushing it think it works. Show you're not going to be deterred. Show you're going to vote for people who will fix it, and make it clear that this is an issue that if a politician embraces, you will vote them out, and others will too.
Is there any chance, and I'm going to throw this out to all of you, is there any chance that we will see lots of votes tossed out this time around as the courts kind of race ahead to decide what they're going to do from moment to moment? Is there a chance that, for instance, in Georgia in 2018, I think it was, they tossed out more than 100,000 voters there, and it made a difference in terms of the gubernatorial race, or so a lot of people think. Is there any chance that we're seeing something like that happening right under our noses?
There's certainly a chance. And part of the reason is that more and more people this year are voting by mail for the obvious reasons connected to the pandemic. When you vote in the polling place, once they check your signature at the poll book and let you into the voting booth, then you know your vote is going to be counted. Because your vote is mixed with everybody else's and they can't find it and take it back, basically. But when you vote by mail, you sign, depending on the state, whether the outer envelope or the inner envelope, you sign the certificate with your name and address and signature. And that has to survive, looking up your name and address in the state registry and checking your signature. And some states do a good job of that and pay particular attention to not tossing out votes because of a claimed signature mismatch. But this is where there's a lot of room for chicanery, shall we say. So there's another way that states can screw up the process on purpose. If you think about what happens if an entire state votes by mail, well, we don't have to guess, because Washington and Oregon and basically most of California and Colorado have been all voting by mail for years now. And so they develop quite a process for checking those signatures, opening the envelopes, preparing stacks of ballots for counting, and then being able to run them through the machines starting maybe the day before Election Day and have results. In the rest of the country, a lot of states have had to shift all at once to vote by mail. And even the states that aren't all officially vote by mail, let's say Pennsylvania, you can expect half the people are going to vote absentee. And so those states realized that they had better get up to speed in how they process those absentee ballots. And New Jersey did a great job of getting prepared to process the absentee ballots. The Pennsylvania legislature deliberately pretty much decided that they're going to screw it up. They will not be allowed to open absentee ballots and process signatures until November 3rd, Election Day itself. And that guarantees that the state of Pennsylvania will not have election results for about a week after November 3rd. And
interesting point. Do we know, we know that back in 2000, it was a good month or more before we had a final decision, and that was really made by the Supreme Court. Any sense how long it's going to take this time around? And this is just sort of a random question, but certainly something I think a lot of voters are concerned about and interested in.
Yeah, I had the opportunity earlier in May to write an op-ed with Ellen Weintraub, who's one of the commissioners of the Federal Elections Commission. And our point was exactly this: it's going to take a while. And that was before the Pennsylvania, and I agree, I think it was deliberate sabotage to slow the process down. It's going to be a while. But again, and we have to stress this, there's going to be an urge in the media to call the race that night. They all want a race to call it first. We all need to pump the brakes and remember that what's important here is to get it right. The part of the confusion and the chaos of the 2000 election was that the media was falling all over itself to call Florida too quickly. They called it for Gore and then backed off. They called it for Bush and backed off. And it led to confusion on all sides. And so we need to have them to hold off until these actual results are in, and to tell their viewers at the start of their broadcast, and they won't do this because they want people to turn in, that they're not going to have probably a winner that night. We could have it. Florida could come in and blow everything out of the water. We don't know just yet, but the odds are pretty good it's going to take a while. But again, that's the way it's supposed to work. We think of the election day, but the results don't have to be certified and sent in until mid-December. We've got time to actually do this right. And if they're not in by then, there are other systems which will do it. We have to be patient. I know that these elections feel like they've gone on for a lifetime, and they probably have, but it's important to get this right and to finish it right. And so it's not going to be probably over on election night, and we all need to be patient.
Well, Professor Shapiro, I see you were just about to say something.
Yeah, I think it's also important to keep in mind, like, we fundamentally don't know who is favored by vote by mail. Like, the best analysis of this by Andy Hall and some folks out at Stanford looked at every adoption of vote by mail from 96 to 2018 and found no effect on partisan vote share, no differential effect on turnout by party, and a significant increase in overall turnout. So it's not like we know this favors one side or the other, and therefore that mucking about with it will favor one side or the other. There's like this theory that it's going to favor the Democrats, and so mucking about with it and increasing the discard rate is going to favor Republicans. We don't actually know that that's true, and the politicians are taking a huge leap into the unknown and kind of like acting out on that theory.
I do want to ask you, Professor Shapiro, in light of the fact that we do have issues of cybersecurity coming up now, do you think that that's going to make a lot of voters more cynical and more questioning in terms of the results, whatever they may be?
You know, I think there is so much cynicism and discomfort baked in around the election among the people who follow politics closely that I don't see how it could elevate that. And I think for the people who don't follow politics that closely, they're probably not following that news that closely. And so I would suspect they're not going to be moved too much either. So I don't think that is going to be the thing which tips people over into not trusting the results. I think the thing that's more likely to tip people into not trusting the results is what Kevin was just describing, which is if we get into this bad news cycle where this network's calling it, that one's not, things are getting announced and then walk back. At that point, I think the average person, not the high information consumers, but the average person is going to look at it and be like, this is just messed up. I can't trust this.
I think there's been a lot of opportunity to educate journalists and in the major networks and news organizations about this issue, that we're not going to know on November 3rd, and that if they call results on November 3rd, they're likely to be embarrassed. And so I think we'll see less of that this year than we did in the year 2000.
Well, let's hope you are absolutely right. I know Professor Howard wanted to say something.
Well, I think too, we need to note that we are in the middle of a huge surge in cases, right? In some key states, right? In the Midwest and the Mountain West. And so Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, it's hard to know, but it looks like we're going to be looking at a significant increase in COVID cases, and probably the deaths, sadly too, 10 days from now, right? So that's what the trends are going. So that will be a backdrop to here, is the worsening of the pandemic. The president said we're turning a corner, but that's clearly not the case when you look at the data. And the cases where the spikes are happening, some of them are these really key battleground states. So I think we need to keep that in mind too, that could affect turnout. It's certainly going to affect the way we're even thinking about the pandemic 10 days from now, if the trends are going to continue as we think they will.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I was just thinking about that overlay between the election and obviously the heightening, if you will, of the coronavirus right now. We saw our largest number of new cases yesterday,
right,
and we're just 10 days out. So that obviously is a huge concern for a whole lot of people. Do you think that is perceived well enough by most voters out there?
Do people? Yes, I think so, because it's going to, you're starting to see hospitals in this area don't have enough beds, right? I mean, you're starting to see that the real impact there when people are seeing. I mean, those of us here in New Jersey, of course, we've lived through that significant first wave where everybody knew somebody affected, but now you're seeing that in these other states that had not been as affected. So I think it's definitely going to be perceived in places like Wisconsin and Iowa.
I've got a wonderful question that came in from somebody here. It says, they're asking about changes in the way we might vote in the future. What about voting at home on a laptop or phone with an ID and a password? Is that even something that that we can see in the near future?
In a word, no. Voting by internet is not securable by any known technology or any technology we can envision in the next few years. You have the problem of hackers being able to hack into those servers that are, receiving and adding up the votes. It's hard to secure those servers, but you have the even worse problem of hackers being able to spread malware onto millions of voters' computers and phones. So you use the app and you think you're sending in a ballot for Smith, and the app, lights up Smith for you, but sends in a ballot for Jones. And it's the absolute consensus of computer scientists and computer security experts that there's just no way to secure internet voting.
Well, obviously, Professor Shapiro, I want you to get in on that. What do you think?
I am bewildered by why any country does anything other than paper and manual counting. It is a complete mystery to me. There's no good reason I can imagine for not being on paper and manual counting.
Oh, I can think
why. I mean, so I can think of some convenience reasons, but weighed against the potential harms of interference in the election, I don't understand.
And that's even with people at least implying that ballots can be thrown in the river or pulled out of the mailbox and dragged down the street.
So that is certainly doable, but much harder to get away with, I think. And maybe I'm wrong about that, but my sense is that there's a proven technology that was, tested and worked for hundreds of years. We moved to this other thing for various reasons of convenience, and that turned out to not be as secure and reliable.
I think hand-marked paper ballots are an absolute must. The question of whether you count them by hand or whether you count them by a machine that you don't fully trust, but you audit by hand, that depends on one thing. In a lot of European countries, in Canada, in Australia, there's usually only one thing on the ballot at a time. It's a parliamentary unitary system. You're voting for one party in parliament. And those kinds of ballots are not too hard to count by hand in the local polling place. And they do it right there in the polling place before those ballots go anywhere, before there's a chance to dump them in the river. In the US, in New Jersey, we have 12 things on the ballot. In California, they have 170 things on the ballot. It's impractical to count those by hand. So I think the use of computers, optical scan voting machines, to count, which they're very accurate at doing when they're not hacked, and then the use of random audits to make sure they weren't hacked this time, is what we're going to have to do in a federal system where states would, arrange their laws to have so many things to be voted on.
I've got another question I wanted to throw towards all of you. Because of concerns about COVID-19, obviously demand for mail-in votes and absentee votes have been at an all-time high, which means there are going to be a record number of ballots to be open on Election Day. Do you think in any way, shape, or form this might dampen turnout on Election Day? I mean, so many of us have been accustomed to the whole process of going down and voting that particular day. But do you think this is going to have an effect? And really, anybody can jump in. What do you think, Professor Howard?
Well, I guess it depends on the state. I'm worried about confusion, right? So in a state like New Jersey, where they mailed everyone a ballot, some people just sort of, like they just automate themselves. They know they go to their polling place. Well, guess what? Their polling place is not going to be open. We only have a few places in every town where people can vote, and only for people who qualify to vote in person because they mailed them, right? So I think as much as I'm glad that so many states have, changed their rules to allow people to vote in different ways, to vote safely, I think there is the risk of confusion because people are used to doing what they're doing, right? And so I think how do people understand? And some states, actually, I'd be interested to hear from Andrew. Some states have done a better job than others in allowing you to track your ballot when you turn it in. And some states, allow you to cure your ballot if you have a problem, if you have a signature match, right? So I don't know, Andrew, if you have a sense of who's doing that well or not. At least for us locally in New Jersey, I'm able to go and see the Mercer County Board of Elections that my ballot's been received and that there wasn't a problem with my signature match. But I don't have a sense of how much variation there is there.
Well, there's a lot of variation. I wrote an article about this on freedomtotinker.com 2 or 3 weeks ago. Those states that have been voting by mail for 5 or 10 years now have developed all sorts of good practices, including that ability to track whether your ballot has been received and whether your signature has been accepted, right? Those states have drop boxes. They look like big mailboxes. They're secured, they're video monitored. And if you put your ballot in the drop box by 8 p.m. on election day or any of the weeks before, it'll be processed the next day. And it was interesting to see New Jersey, which does not have a history of lots of vote by mail, where typically it's 8% vote by mail, come up to speed on all of that in 6 months. But there are a bunch of states that have not done that have been very slow to adapt their vote by mail processes to the huge volume we're going to see this year. And in those states, I would actually recommend people put on their masks and vote in person to have a better chance that their vote will be counted and counted on time. And so one of the biggest confusion is it's so different in every state that you need to look up, what is your state doing, and should I vote in person or by mail in my state?
We've got a graduate alum, J.D. Liza, who has been an active forward thinker on social media today and really has a lot of questions here, but specifically wanted to ask Professor Shapiro here. He finds it interesting there are more voting jurisdictions than police jurisdictions, whatever that may mean. And you talked about international bad actors, he says, but what about potential nefarious actors here in the U.S.? Do we know as much about them, and are they as much of a concern? And we have certainly seen lots of groups kind of peeking their head out from under rocks. But are you concerned about any effect on the elections?
So I suspect, and this is like pure conjecture, that the magnitude of that influence directly on the vote in those different jurisdictions is going to be tiny compared to the way the state policies that create confusion come in, or the things that have been done that are trying to, in targeted ways, suppress the vote. So limiting the number of polling stations, changing early voting hours, restrictive purges of voter rolls. All those things are likely to have a much bigger effect than some kind of skullduggerous targeting of a few isolated polling precincts, would be my guess.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that? Professor? Okay. I kind of want to go back to the whole issue again of day-to-day changes and what's happening in the elections, whether it is courts intervening in last-minute decisions or governors making rules that take effect as of yesterday or something like that. Is there, in your mind, an overall concern about some of those changes that are happening so that voters can't even keep up with whatever the latest change may be?
I think it's definitely a problem. I'm sure others have, but I think we, both in terms of, as Andrew noted, the general shift to mail-in voting of people who have never voted by mail before. I mean, I'm like Melanie. I have an annual tradition, or not annual, but whenever we go to vote, bring the kids, we go to the same polling place. It's their school. We vote there. It's tradition. We have it down cold. We know exactly what we do. Mail-in voting, I'd never done before. And again, I'm a professor of history. I cover politics pretty deeply. Never done it before. Didn't know which part of the step I was going to screw up, put in the wrong envelope, sign it, really nervous about that. So I think, and that was in a state, as Andrew noted, that did this very well. There are states that are changing the rules after votes have been cast and people have gotten an envelope that says, sign it here. And the courts say, no, they have to sign it somewhere else. They've already sent that thing in. And so there's going to be massive confusion here. And I think it just underscores a point here, which is that, yeah, we have a lot more on the ballot, as Andrew noted, but we intentionally have made our voting process much more difficult and much more onerous and much more confusing than it ought to be. And there are a lot of things we can do to make it simpler and more reliable and more trustworthy. And it just takes the will at the national and the state level to actually get that done.
Yeah. Anybody else on that?
Well, I'll just jump in and say that I agree with all those points, but the silver lining is actually the early data on young people voting.
Yes.
Which is really exciting that voting at much higher rates. And so, because, we worry that, that people would be disaffected and this is frustrating and the rules keep changing and all these other things we've been talking about. But that gives me hope that that young people are voting at greater rates. Now, of course, aren't they, Andrew? Young people are more subject to having their ballots, their mail-in ballots rejected, right? Because they're not used to doing signatures. They haven't written checks for decades, like some of us have. I think there are some issues with things like that, but just the fact that there's greater participation is really exciting. That gives me hope. Just all the good news early, and even these lines. As sad as it is to see people waiting for hours and hours, it's also really exciting to see people wanting to vote and caring.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We've got just a couple of minutes left, and I do want to give each of you a chance to say something. But before we go, I do want to ask you about the vaccine and what that's going to mean, and certainly after the election.
Well, so, we've been talking about trust in institutions, and it's directly relevant to the question of if and when we get a vaccine. And well, it looks like there may be a vaccine approved by the end of the year, but it may take up to a year for distribution and to get everybody vaccinated. It's going to be quite a process. And my big concern is that polling shows more than half the people polled say they don't want to take it and they don't trust it. And so, this goes to this broader question of trust in institutions. And so I think that's going to be one question. So they're not obviously directly related, but if we come out of this election cycle, people losing trust in institutions, what does that mean for people's willingness to take a vaccine if there's one that's approved, when we need to get significant participation in vaccination for it to be effective? It's not the vaccine that is that's going to solve the COVID crisis. It's vaccination that's going to solve it and people getting it. So, I think they are related in that sense. Are people going to trust and be willing to take it? And especially those most vulnerable populations who need it the most.
I'm going to give each one of you about 30 seconds to wrap up your thoughts on this. And first of all, let me thank you so much for an incredibly interesting and provocative conversation in so many ways. But I want to ask you, from your own areas of expertise, what you're looking out for in the period after the election and before we have a final winner, because as you've all indicated, that may be a little while. But I just want to hear from each of you what your final thoughts are after the election. And let me begin with you, Professor Shapiro.
So I think the biggest thing that I'm concerned with is people spreading kind of malicious rumors about various forms of tampering with the ballot and various kinds of political violence going on in different parts of the country. And I think there's, a reasonable chance we're going to see some isolated, politically oriented violence coming after the election. But I suspect it will be limited. The only thing that could kind of drive it to amplify is if people misunderstand the scale and scope of what's going on. And I worry a little bit about misinformation doing that. I worry much less than I did a few months ago, because the large platforms have shown that they are very willing to turn the circuit breakers on for certain stories, as they did with the Hunter Biden laptop story in the New York Post. And so to the extent that willingness is there, that concern is much diminished from what it was a few weeks ago.
All right. An actual hopeful note. That's good. Professor Appel?
I think we should look forward to improving our election processes for the next election and the election after that. It's a continuous process for decades. And it's got to mean let the people vote, stop suppressing the vote, but also count the votes in a trustworthy way. And a lot of states made good progress on that by abandoning their hackable touchscreen paperless voting machines. Now that we've got hackable optical scan voting machines, we protect our elections by adopting audits, random audits of the paper ballots that the voters actually marked, so that we can detect if the machines have been hacked to alter the outcome of an election. And if we detect that by the random sample of what's actually printed, written on those ballots compared with what the machine said, then we can correct it by a manual recount. So that's an important way we have to protect our elections going forward. And only 3 or 4 states are doing that well right now.
But you think at the very least, people are a lot more aware of what goes into the process now than they were even the last time around.
Yes, and at least we have now paper ballots marked by the voters that really could be recounted by hand.
Right. Professor Howard?
Well, I'm very worried about the surge in cases in COVID. So I'm very worried as the current surge, but also as we're heading into the winter months about what's coming with coronavirus. But I'm feeling good about election day and the fact that we've spread out a lot of this voting early, and so that voting will be safe and people are taking precautions.
And you think this is a process we may see in the future and not just a...
Yes, just like COVID has laid bare a lot of things about our healthcare system that aren't working, and hopefully we're going to be learning how to strengthen it as we come out of this. I'm hoping the same happens with voting.
All right, and Professor Cruz, I'm going to give you the last word.
Well, I would agree with all the things I'm worried about are things that other folks have. I'd add one again to repeat my point. I think we really have to be patient, and so I'm going to hope that people will show patience in this period and really wait to vote, not just in terms of making sure we have an accurate sense of who won, but also how well they did and how big they won. We only have to look back to 2018. And it was clear the Democrats had retaken the House, but the initial news stories were, they barely retook it. It was by 20 or something. It wound up being about double that. It was actually a very significant a movement on the part of House Democrats to retake it. And yet their accomplishments were muted by the fact that the media wrote their stories the day after, and then a week later, the numbers had greatly changed. So I think we all need to be patient. Both as ordinary voters, but also I hope those who are kind of crafting the national narrative of what this election will be in journalism show some patience. I know they're on deadlines. I know they've got stories to write and editors to please. But I've dealt with those editors too. Trust me, you can tell them to calm down and need to wait. There are other stories you can write in the meantime. Maybe the wait itself will be a fascinating story that people will want to read. How about that?
I think you're absolutely right. And speaking on behalf of the media, we're all learning on the job too. This is
Sure.
Incredibly unusual election season for all of us. And I think we're all just kind of waiting to see what's going to happen, and hopefully we'll not jump the gun. I'm not going to speak on behalf of all my colleagues, but I think that there are a lot of responsible folks out there who are going to make sure that it happens that way. Well, let me just say what a pleasure it has been to chat with all of you all, especially as we look towards less than 2 weeks, 10 days to the election. And we appreciate your time so very, very much. And I want to thank everybody who was able to listen in on this conversation. It was incredibly lively and interesting. And I want to thank you as well. So everybody at home, until next time, keep up the forward thinking. We're certainly going to need it between now and the next election. Thank you so much. And we appreciate you.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for watching.
Be well. Be safe. Thanks.
That's right. And go vote.
Go vote.
That's right. Go vote.
That's exactly right. Go vote. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you for engaging in this Forward Fest. Be sure to keep the conversation going on social media with hashtag PrincetonForward, all one word. And visit forwardthinking.princeton.edu to access more forward-thinking content, including a downloadable resource guide for this month's Forward Fest that will help you dive deeper into all these great ideas. Again, we are glad you have been a part of Forward Fest. Until next time, keep up the forward thinking.